Carl Jung once said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent." And that's exactly what happens in narcissistic families. You don't grow up being seen, you grow up being assigned a role, not based on who you are, but based on what the narcissist needs you to be. That's not parenting, that's psychological theater. And the worst part, you probably believed it was your fault. According to Dr. Ramani Devasula, a leading expert in narcissistic abuse, over 10% of the population exhibits narcissistic traits strong enough to impact relationships, but within families, that dynamic gets hidden behind cultural taboos, loyalty, tradition, silence. And what makes narcissistic family systems so damaging is this: they rewrite reality, and they do it with surgical precision. Let me ask you something. Have you ever walked away from a family interaction feeling twisted inside, like your emotions were invalid, but you couldn't prove why? That's not weakness. It's one of the most common tactics used in narcissistic familism, manipulating your perception until you doubt your memory. You question your worth. You carry the guilt. Even Sigmund Freud, controversial yet foundational, noted how childhood environments shape the superego, the voice in your head that becomes your inner critic. And when that critic is modeled after a narcissistic parent, it doesn't guide it. You grow up thinking, if I just did better, they'd love me. But the truth, narcissistic love is transactional. It is based on control, not connection. Neuroscience confirms this too. Studies on survivors of childhood emotional abuse show alterations in the amygdala and hippocampus, parts of the brain responsible for threat detection and memory. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, in The Body Keeps the Score, explains how these brain changes create a heightened sensitivity to rejection and emotional chaos. So when your parent says, "You're too sensitive," it's not just cruel, it's ironic. They made you sensitive by forcing you to live in constant vigilance. And here's something no one tells you. Narcissistic families are systems, not just individuals. Dr. Murray Bowen, one of the pioneers of family systems theory, discovered that dysfunctional families create a homeostasis of emotional pain. Everyone plays a role. If you were the scapegoat, you weren't broken. You were just the only one who didn't comply. Why do they do this? Because narcissists cannot regulate their self-worth internally. They need mirrors. And when you reflect something they don't want to see, truth, strength, independence, they shatter the mirror and blame the shards on you. That's why even your healing triggers them, because it proves you can become whole without them. Even Marcus Aurelius, writing nearly 2,000 years ago, knew the cost of living under false narratives. "If someone can prove me wrong," he said, "I will change, for I seek the truth." But narcissists never seek truth. They seek control. So they twist the narrative. You're difficult. You're dramatic. You're ungrateful. And over time, those labels stick deeper than scars. But you are not broken. You are not the problem. The real problem is a system designed to make you doubt yourself, to isolate you, to weaponize guilt as a leash. But here's the truth that changes everything. Once you see the pattern, you can step out of it. You can start to hear that inner voice and say, "That's not mine. That was planted there." You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe anyone the version of you that makes them comfortable. And the moment you start asking, "What if it wasn't me?" that's the moment you begin to wake up. This is where the shift begins, not with blame, but with awareness. Because they didn't raise you, they trained you to behave, to perform, to shrink. But that script, you can rewrite it. And in the next part, we'll look at what's happening inside the minds and theirs, and how your brain was reshaped to fit a story that was never yours to carry. What if the scars you carry aren't visible because they were never meant to be seen? They were meant to be felt deeply, quietly, and for a long time. In 2018, neuroscientists at Harvard discovered something terrifying. Early emotional trauma alters the shape of the developing brain, especially the amygdala, which controls fear, and the prefrontal cortex, which manages emotional regulation. When you grow up in a narcissistic environment, your brain doesn't learn how to feel safe, it learns how to survive. You stop asking, "What do I need?" and start asking, "What will keep them from exploding?" Dr. Bessel van der Kolk put it bluntly. Trauma is not the story of something that happened back then. It's the current imprint of that pain on mind, body, and soul. This is what narcissistic families leave behind. Not just bad memories, but biological imprints that shape how you see yourself, how you trust, and how you feel about deserving love. Carl Jung believed that what remains unconscious controls your life. In a narcissistic household, The rule is clear: don't speak, don't feel, don't challenge. So you bury your truth. You smile when you're hurt. You apologize when you've done nothing wrong. And your nervous system adapts. Chronic anxiety becomes normal. Hypervigilance becomes identity. Brain scans of adults raised in high-conflict families show increased activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, the region linked to error detection. It means your brain gets wired to constantly scan for what might go wrong and how do I fix it. That's why even as an adult, you over-explain yourself. You replay conversations. You feel guilty for setting boundaries. You're not weak. You were trained for war in a place that called itself home. Dr. Gabor said something that hits like lightning. If you had to suppress your authenticity in order to be accepted, what you learned was that love is conditional. That belief doesn't just fade, it drives every relationship you touch until you confront it. And narcissistic families never taught you how to confront. They taught you how to obey. Now let's look at the narcissist's brain. Studies show that individuals with narcissistic traits have abnormal activity in the default mode network, the system linked to self-referential thinking. It's why they make everything about themselves. They don't listen. They don't reflect. They perform empathy, but don't feel it. That's not an opinion. That's data. Functional MRI scans reveal reduced gray matter volume in regions associated with empathy, like the left anterior insula. Translation: narcissists don't just choose not to feel your pain. Many lack the wiring to process it the way you do. That's why your suffering was always minimized. They weren't interested in truth. They were interested in control. Freud, for all his flaws, was right about one thing: repression creates repetition. And unless we bring those early wounds into the light, we'll unconsciously repeat the same dynamics at work, in love, in friendship, hoping that someone, anyone, will finally see us. But the first person who needs to see you is you. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That's where this work begins. Not by changing them, but by understanding the machine you were raised inside, by seeing your anxiety as a message, not a flaw, by tracing your patterns not to shame them, but to break them. You were not born insecure. You were conditioned to question your value. You were not born afraid of being a burden. You were taught that love had a price. And now, you begin the work of untangling your nervous system from a narrative that never belonged to you. Because healing isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about giving your brain a new story to follow, one based on truth, safety, and self. In the next part, we'll talk about the guilt that traps you, the invisible leash that makes you stay connected to people who drain your spirit, and more importantly, why choosing yourself is not selfish. It's survival. If walking away from someone who hurt you feels like betrayal, you're not alone. That knot in your chest, the voice that whispers, "Maybe I'm the bad one," that's not your conscience, it's your programming. And in narcissistic families, guilt isn't just an emotion, it's a system of control. Dr. Susan Forward, in her book, Toxic Parents, explains that guilt is the primary weapon used by emotionally manipulative parents to keep their children obedient. You were taught to feel bad not when you did something wrong, but when you did something independent. That's the trap. The moment you expressed your own truth, your own boundaries, the response was cold silence, anger, or subtle disappointment. And your nervous system learned fast. Love disappears when I act like myself. Carl Jung described this perfectly. Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. Narcissistic parents see your freedom as their failure, so they reframe your growth as abandonment, and the child internalizes the message: if I leave, I'm heartless. If I stay, I'm good. But here's the truth. Staying doesn't make you good, it makes you silent. And silence is exactly what a narcissistic system requires to keep functioning. Freud believed that guilt originates when we go against the superego, the internalized voice of authority. But what if that voice was never yours to begin with? What if the rules you keep punishing yourself for breaking were written by someone who only loved you when it served them? That's where Stoicism offers a way out. Epictetus wrote, "Remember that it is not he who gives abuse or blows who insults, but the view we take of these things as insulting." In other words, pain is real, but guilt can be examined. It can be deconstructed. And once we stop reacting from the child's self, one who is desperate to be accepted, we begin acting from the adult who knows their worth. Guilt is a feeling, but facts break feelings. And here's a fact: Choosing peace is not abandonment. Choosing distance is not cruelty. If a relationship requires you to sacrifice your dignity to maintain it, it's not love, it's dependency. That's why trauma-bonded children often feel guilty long after the abuse has stopped. Their emotional wiring was built around approval, not authenticity. Let's talk numbers. A 2022 study from the University of Michigan found that 68% of adult children from high-conflict or narcissistic families experience chronic guilt after creating distance. But among those who held their boundaries, 87% reported an increase in life satisfaction and mental clarity within a year. That's not just healing, that's evidence. Dr. Lindsay Gibson, author of Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, notes that narcissistic families often use covert contracts, unspoken rules that say, if you stay loyal, we'll pretend to love you. But it's conditional. And the moment you challenge the narrative, the contract is revoked. You might have noticed this already. You say no one time and suddenly you're labeled as selfish, distant, cold. That's not a healthy family response. That's emotional blackmail. And let's be honest, it hurts. Because you're not just losing people, you're losing the illusion that they ever truly knew or loved the real you. That grief is real. But it's also necessary, because pretending costs your soul more than letting go ever will. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." But in narcissistic families, right and wrong are defined by control, not truth. So your job now isn't to convince them. It's to redefine your own compass. You were not put here to carry their pain. You were not born to be the emotional regulator of people who never learned to face themselves. Guilt will scream when you start walking away, but that's not a sign you're wrong. It's a sign you're finally walking out of the cage they built for you. In the next part, we'll decode the architecture of narcissistic family roles: the golden child, the scapegoat, the invisible one, and how those identities were assigned to manipulate, not nurture. And more importantly, how to drop the role and reclaim the self. You didn't choose the role, but it shaped everything. How you see yourself, how you love, how you shrink or speak or stay silent when your voice wants to rise. In narcissistic families, identity isn't discovered, it's assigned, and not based on your nature, but on their needs. You become a function, not a person. A mirror, not a soul. Family therapist Dr. Carol McBride explains this with precision. Narcissistic parents create a system where roles are rigid, survival-based, and entirely conditional. You are loved to the degree you comply. Carl Jung called this the mask, the persona we wear to be accepted, even if it costs us the truth. In a narcissistic household, the mask isn't optional. It's the price of peace. If you were the scapegoat, your role was clear. Carry the blame. You were the emotional trash can, the lightning rod, the one who caused the drama by reacting to what no one else would dare name. But what you didn't realize is that the scapegoat is often the most conscious, the one who sees too much, feels too much, and refuses to be silent. That's why they targeted you, because you were awake. If you were the golden child, the illusion was safety. You were praised, but only when you echoed the narcissist's worldview. You were not loved, you were used, and deep down, you know this, because the approval was always shaky. One wrong move, one sign of independence, and their pedestal cracked. That love was never yours. It was a spotlight you had to stay frozen in. And if you were the invisible child, you became a ghost, quiet, adaptable, disconnected from your own wants and needs, because invisibility was safer than scrutiny. But here's the wound. You never learned how to exist in a world that wants you to take up space. So now, as an adult, you apologize when you speak. You shrink in relationships. You vanish to stay safe. Murray Bowen, the founder of family systems theory, showed that these roles serve one function: to protect the emotional dysfunction of the parent, not the child, never the child. It's why narcissistic families resist healing, because healing threatens the hierarchy, and the roles must remain. If you tried to step out of yours, the system attacks not just the narcissist, but others who depend on the order staying intact. Even Freud, who shaped early family dynamics theory, recognized the cycle. Roles in the family unconsciously repeat unless disrupted, and breaking out of a role often means becoming the villain in a story you never wrote. But here's the truth they hope you never realize. Roles are just scripts. They're not your soul, and you can stop acting. Research shows that when people begin to identify and reject these family roles, something remarkable happens. Their anxiety drops, their relationships improve, they become more authentic, even if it costs them connection to those who benefited from their silence. Dr. Lindsay Gibson, again, says it best: emotionally immature parents raise children to meet their needs, not to become independent humans. And that's the shift, becoming human again, not a function. The Stoics knew this intimately. Seneca wrote, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." When you step out of the role, you step into adversity, but it's the kind that reveals who you really are. You'll face resistance. The family will call you selfish, dramatic, disloyal, but what they really mean is disobedient. And in a system built on control, disobedience looks like betrayal. But in truth, it's freedom. You were never meant to be the scapegoat, or the performer, or the ghost. You were meant to become whole. And that starts with identifying the mask you were given and having the courage to take it off. In the next part, we'll explore how silence isn't weakness. It's strategy. How stepping back, going quiet, and choosing boundaries can be the most powerful act of defiance and healing you'll ever make. They told you silence was weakness. That walking away meant you lost. That setting boundaries meant you didn't care. But what if the most powerful move was the one that made no sound? Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." And in narcissistic families, that revenge is silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of clarity. The kind that doesn't beg, doesn't explain, doesn't argue. The kind that understands. You don't owe anyone your energy just because you share their blood. In the chaos of narcissistic dynamics, silence becomes your weapon. Not against them, but for you. Because when you stop feeding the fire, when you stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, something rare happens. You find peace. You hear your own voice again. Neurologically, this isn't just emotional fluff, it's science. Studies in effective neuroscience show that every confrontation with a toxic person floods your nervous system with cortisol and adrenaline. Chronic exposure rewires your brain for hypervigilance. You don't respond, you react, and that reaction becomes your default state. But withdrawal, real withdrawal, gives the brain the space to rewire, to breathe. Dr. Judith Herman, in her groundbreaking work, Trauma and Recovery, describes withdrawal not as avoidance, but as a sacred phase of healing, the moment survivors reclaim authority over their own story by removing themselves from hostile environments. It's not giving up. It's choosing yourself in a system that taught you didn't exist. Silence creates space, and in that space, clarity grows. Carl Jung once said, "Solitude is for me a fount of healing which makes my life worth living." In narcissistic families, your voice was twisted into something dangerous. Your truth made them uncomfortable. So you adapted. You learned to speak in ways that didn't threaten. Or worse, you stopped speaking altogether, not to protect them, but to survive. But silence now isn't survival. It's sovereignty. It's why so many survivors of narcissistic abuse enter what therapists call low contact or no contact strategies. Not because they hate their family, but because they finally understand proximity doesn't equal love, and the idea that cutting contact is too harsh is often planted by those who benefit from your silence. In fact, recent research from the University of Sheffield shows that adults who go no contact with toxic family members report a 46% decrease in symptoms of anxiety and depressive episodes within 6 months. That's not emotional, that's biological liberation. And yet guilt creeps in. You wonder if silence makes you cold. But remember this: narcissistic families rely on your guilt to keep the game going. They poke you, provoke you, then accuse you of being too sensitive when you react. Silence breaks that loop. You stop dancing their dance. You step off the stage. Epictetus taught, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Choosing silence means being misunderstood, sometimes even hated, but it also means choosing integrity over illusion, choosing peace over performance. The narcissist will interpret your silence as punishment, as a tactic, as drama, because they can't imagine silence without agenda. But yours is not tactical, it's medicinal. It's the moment you stop being a character in their story and start writing your own. And maybe for the first time, you'll realize how much of your life was spent explaining yourself to people who never listened. Silence reveals that truth, not by force, but by absence. In the next and final part, We'll talk about what comes after the silence, after the escape, after the role collapses. How do you rebuild? How do you create a life not built in opposition to pain, but in pursuit of freedom? That's where your real story begins. The silence has done its work. The chaos is no longer deafening. But now comes the question that lingers in the quiet. Who am I when I'm no longer surviving them? Viktor Frankl, who survived the horrors of concentration camps, wrote something that becomes a guiding light in this moment. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Escaping the narcissistic web is not the end of the story, it's the beginning. Because healing isn't about just cutting ties, it's about rebuilding a self that was never allowed to fully exist. Here's what no one tells you. Once the noise stops, grief arrives. Grief for the childhood you never had. Grief for the version of you that spent years trying to earn love that should have been freely given. Grief for the identity built on roles you never chose. And grief, as the Stoics knew well, is not weakness, it's a natural reaction to seeing things clearly for the first time. Marcus Aurelius reminds us, look well into yourself. There is a source of strength which will always spring up if you will always look. That strength is your new compass. But to use it, you must do something radical. Stop waiting for their apology. Stop hoping for the moment they finally understand, because clinging to that hope keeps you emotionally tied to the very system you escaped. According to Dr. Nicole LaPera, known as the holistic psychologist, the brain can change its narrative through conscious daily action. This is called neuroplasticity, the power of the brain to rewire itself. What does that mean for you? It means every small decision you make that affirms your autonomy, your peace, your worth actually changes your biology. You're not just surviving, and that means creating a life that isn't reactionary. Not a life spent avoiding triggers or managing guilt, but a life rooted in freedom. It might begin small, choosing friendships that feel safe, pursuing creativity you once suppressed, speaking your truth without But these small things are actually massive. They are acts of rebellion, of return, of rebirth. You'll still hear the old voices sometimes, that inner critic forged by years of invalidation. But now you answer it differently, not with shame but with truth. You say, that's not mine. You remind yourself that you are not too sensitive. You are sensitive because you were forced to feel what others refuse to acknowledge. You are not too much. You were just placed in a room too small to hold your spirit. Freud once said, out of your vulnerabilities will come your strength. And now, that strength becomes visible. It shows up in your boundaries, in your softness that no longer needs to harden to be safe, in your joy that no longer feels guilty for existing. Many survivors of narcissistic families feel an urge to help others, and that, too, is part of the rebuilding. When you speak your truth, when you share what you've learned, you're not just healing yourself. You're lighting a path for others still trapped in the dark. The legacy ends with you. That's the quiet revolution. You're not passing on the pain. You're building something new. Seneca wrote, every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. And this is your new beginning. You've walked through fire, unlearning the lies, peeling off the labels, stepping out of roles that were never yours. Now it's time to write your name on your life, not as a survivor, but as the author of something completely new. You've reclaimed your story. Now live it freely, and never hand the pen back.